Professor, if we can pick matters up in relation to discussion of surrogate testing in 1986 at NHBT 0057025_001, please. This is a letter dated the 23rd of May 1986 from you to Dr. Smithers at the Department of Health. If we pick it up in the third line of the first paragraph, now that we've routine anti-HTLV3 screening of blood donations, which has reduced a very small risk of transfusion-transmitted HTLV3 infection even further, there is pressure to introduce screening to reduce the incidence of post-transfusion non-A, non-B hepatitis. Just pausing there, from whom was there pressure, and on whom was there pressure?
If I remember correctly, it was from the liver disease specialists and from the haemophilia director's colleagues.
And then the letter continues, we know that there is underreporting in this country, but it appears that there is a much lower incidence of post-transfusion non-A, non-B hepatitis than in the US. On the other hand, the reports of the sometimes severe sequelae of this type of hepatitis, particularly in recipients who've received blood products originating from large donor pools, have caused concern. And then you go on to talk about the position in the States. In the US, the American Association of Blood Banks has announced this month that routine screening of blood donors for anti-HBC and ALT levels as surrogate markers for donors at high risk of transmitting non-A, non-B hepatitis has been approved as a requirement and will be introduced into the association standards. The FDA is also considering this subject. Yet in this country, we do not even know the current prevalence of anti-HBC in blood donors, and we might predict that the rate has decreased since the introduction of measures to exclude high-risk donors. We need to carry out a study of these surrogate high-risk markers in British blood donors, and anti-HBC is a practical marker to choose, as it relates not only indirectly to HTLV3 and non-A, non-B hepatitis, but also very directly to hepatitis B. We would also need to follow up recipients of anti-HBC positive donations, and this would entail a great deal of work and medical time. Once we had this information, we could then start making informed decisions about the need for this surrogate screening and the implications in terms of cost, donations lost, etc. I know that Dr. Fraser of the Bristol RTC shares our concern over this matter and would be willing to cooperate in a joint study of anti-HBC prevalence in donors. Could you please let me know what your feelings are on this subject, please? We can hardly start deciding policies on our approach to anti-HBC and ALT screening when we do not know the background data. It's I think, right to understand from this letter that the approach you were urging on the Department of Health, in this document at least, is to say, before a decision is taken, there must be further studies of the type outlined in the letter. Is that fair?
Before a decision is taken, we need to know whether we have a problem in this country. We need to know what the problem is in this country.
Was it not already the case that you knew there was a problem? You may not have been able to quantify it, but there could have been no doubt, could there, by 1986, that non-A, non-B hepatitis post-transfusion did occur with potentially, as your letter says, severe sequelae?
Yes, it did occur, but we didn't know the magnitude of it. You know, as I said yesterday, we had about 4 cases a year, and not all of them were non-A, non-B. Some of them were hepatitis B.
And the kind of study you were describing in this letter, it's not a study that could be undertaken quickly, is it? It would be something that would take place over, if it was ever authorised and funded, would take place over quite a long period of time, would it not?
No, the original study was to know to test donations for anti-col and to see whether those previous donations had, because most of our donors were repeat, to see if previous donations had go back to the patients and see whether they had transmitted.
If we just look at the previous page, if we look at the last 6 lines or so, 7 or 8 lines, sorry. So you talk there, I think, about 2 different pieces of work: a study of the surrogate high-risk markers in British blood donors using anti-HBC as your marker. But then you talk about also needing to follow up. So let me take this in stages. That was to establish the extent of in which anti-HBC would be found in the donor population.
Yes.
And then you say we also need to follow up recipients of positive donations, which would entail a great deal of work and medical time. The purpose of that, as I understand your thinking, was to see the extent to which it was being transmitted through donation.
Yes.
That would not be a short exercise. You say yourself there it would entail a great deal of work and medical time. Yes. And what you were saying to the Department of Health, obviously it was for them to make their own mind up, but what you were saying was that you needed both those before you could start making informed decisions. I
think that's what I meant.
And that's what I'm suggesting would, as at 1986, mean you'd be looking at a decision-making process that would not be a matter of weeks or months. It would be a matter of years, would it not, before what you're describing could enable the department to start making informed decisions?
I think that in a year we would have had, not years, but I remember discussing this, and because our Scottish colleagues had said that it would take many years, and we believe that we could have a reply in a year.
If we go to PRSC 0003557, this is a little later in 1986, September 1986. You wrote again to Dr. Smithers at the DHSS, enclosing a proposed pilot study of post-transfusion non-A non-B hepatitis. You say, I've already had some semi-political questions asked about the lack of screening in the UK when compared with the USA. Do you know what you were referring to when you talked about semi-political questions?
I can't remember.
And then you say, furthermore, I'm optimistic that a well-designed trial may show that a surrogate screening for NA and B hepatitis carriers in blood donations in this country is neither indicated nor cost-effective. It might be said that's quite a curious way of putting it, optimistic that this wouldn't be required. Why would that be a cause for optimism?
That if we were not transmitting it, that would be wonderful, if we were not transmitting non-A, non-B.
And then you ask if money is forthcoming. I'd be grateful for an early reply. I leave any involvement to the Bristol RTC to you. The maximum number of RTCs involved should be 2. I'm not going to go through the details of the proposal, but it's over the page. It continues for several pages, but that sets out the provisional plan. Perhaps I should just look at the bottom of the page, where item 7 is to follow up both donors and recipients with any evidence of hepatitis to assess the long-term implications. Now, did you receive funding from the Department of Health for this study?
I do not remember if it was this study or there was a 3-center study for to test for ALT and anti-core, but I can't remember whether it was related to this letter or whether it was something different.
And my understanding in terms of timing is that the funding for the study that was undertaken at the 3 centres was approved in 1988. Does that accord with your recollection? If you can't say, don't worry.
I think so.
So it was again. It was there's on any view you didn't get a quick response and quick funding for this for what you were asking for. Can we then go, still in 86, to a discussion at an RTD meeting, CBLA 000235, please. This is 8th of October 1986. You were in attendance, and if we turn to page 7, bottom of the page, we can see the discussion under the heading anti-HBC and/or ALT testing. The chairman reminded directors that the possibility of screening for anti-HBC had been discussed previously, and that studies of the incidence of anti-HBC in the donor population had been undertaken at Edgware, Bristol and Manchester about 3 years ago. Developments in America meant that this topic must be considered again, as anti-HBC/ALT screening was soon to be essential for the accreditation of blood banks in the USA. The chairman proposed that the RTD should approach the DHSS to fund a prospective study of 10,000 donations to see if the incidence of anti-HBC had changed since this was last examined. He added that haemophilia directors were pressing for plasma for fractionation to be tested for both anti-HBC and for abnormal ALT levels. It was agreed that a further trial should be undertaken at Edgware, Bristol and possibly Manchester, and that an approach be made to Dr. Smithers and Dr. Moore for assistance with this. It was recognised, however, that even if the incidence had reduced significantly since the last trial because of self-exclusion or for other reasons, the introduction of anti-HBC/ALT screening seemed very likely. Did you share the view in the autumn of 1986 expressed here that whatever the study showed, the introduction of screening was very likely?
I cannot remember when my views changed.
And then if we go to CBLA 000235/8_001, this is the next RTD meeting, January 1987, at which you were present. Now, the pages are out of order. So if we go, first of all, to the bottom of the second page, we've got the heading anti-HBC and ALT screening. Dr. Gunson reported that the Working Party on Transfusion-Associated Hepatitis was due to meet on the following day to finalise a proposal to the DHSS to fund a limited study of 12,000 donors looking for anti-HBC and abnormal ALT with follow-up of selected donors and possibly recipients. And then there's a further discussion in relation to that. Dr. Napier raises a question about a study beginning with transfused patients. Dr. Gunson reported this had been discussed, but was felt to be costly, difficult and not practical. The proposed approach would give information. Can we then go to page 4, please, because page 3 is out of order. About the effect of anti-HBC and ALT screening on donor panels and blood collection. So if we can just go back to the bottom of the second page. If we just look at those last couple of lines, as far as you can recall, had you been party to discussions about the discussions that Dr. Gunson refers to about it being costly, difficult and not practical to undertake a study beginning with transfused patients?
I don't recall having discussed it with him.
In any event, we're now, it's fair to say, in January 1987, and what's being talked about is still the making of an approach for funding for a study to be undertaken. The study hasn't yet been funded or begun. Looking at it now, do you think this was being considered quickly enough, or was it all taking far too long?
The latter, it was taking far too long.
Can we then please go to PRSC 00014444. If you look at the bottom half of the page, right-hand side, You'll see, Professor Contreras, there's an article by Professor Cash and his colleagues, a letter, about non-A, non-B surrogate testing with the irrational, perhaps, but inescapable heading. I'm not going to go through it because we've looked at it already in the inquiry and you've seen it in advance of your evidence. But the purpose of putting it on screen is I think you and Dr. Barbara wrote a response to this, and that's what I want to ask you about. So if we have PRSE 0003767, First of August 1987, right-hand column, testing of blood donations for non-A, non-B hepatitis. So we'll see when we go over the page that it's authored by you and Dr. Barbara. You say, in their contribution to the current debate in the Lancet, our Scottish colleagues argue the case for surrogate testing of blood donations for non-A, non-B hepatitis. We take issue with several points. And then this is your first point. Has the time for a prospective study already passed? This seems to imply that the longer an unproven test is used, the greater becomes the pressure to use it. This is not an argument that should commend itself to those practicing transfusion medicine. Why should we have to wait 3 to 4 years for an answer? If the problem is serious, this will be revealed in acute non-A, non-B hepatitis within a year of initiating the study. The need for controlled studies of the incidence of non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis will not disappear with the introduction of routine screening of blood donations with tests of unproven value. Indeed, trials are necessary in different countries where the incidence of non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis is likely to vary as widely as does the incidence of positivity for putative markers such as AntiHCV. I'll read the whole letter, Professor Contreras, I think, and then ask you about it. So that's the first question that you pose. Next paragraph, how far can the argument stretch that all known methods should be used to avoid the risk of non-A, non-B after transfusion? The bulk of non-A, non-B may still be transmitted even after surrogate screening. Are we certain that patients would succeed in a legal action if they contract non-A, non-B hepatitis after the transfusion of blood untested for anti-HBC? Why should non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis be such a special case that we have to make tremendous efforts to prevent occasional infections? What about the transmission by transfusion of agents such as cytomegalovirus or HTLV1, for which there are specific tests but which are not screened for routinely? With regard to pooled plasma products, can anyone really feel confident that the 30% decrease in virus load predicted from US studies as a result of surrogate testing would have any obvious impact on transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis when 70% of virus remains in the plasma pool? How can the impact of transfusion-transmitted AIDS be compared with that of transfusion-transmitted non-A, non-B hepatitis, whose consequences seem minor? We doubt if the public, since consumer reassurance is being invoked, sees non-A, non-B hepatitis in the same light as AIDS. The significance of HBV and HIV infection are well known. The clinical importance of non-A, non-B hepatitis has to be sought. Transfusion services must not bow to irrational pressure for measures whose efficacy is unproven. In the UK, transfusion centre directors resisted commercial pressure for premature introduction of unsatisfactory screening tests for anti-HIV. They should show the same resolution with non-A, non-B hepatitis. At our transfusion centre, 400,000 blood components are available for transfusion per annum. We've received an average of only 4 reports of non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis annually for the past 10 years. And we repeatedly remind clinicians of the need to report infective complications of blood transfusion. A realistic estimate of the annual cost of surrogate screening for non-A, non-B hepatitis in the UK would be £9 million. Our colleagues' estimate of £2 per test, which test, seems too low, and to it must be added the cost of counselling 3 to 4% of blood donors. It is vital to extend the few available studies of transfusion recipients with more complete follow-up of untransfused patients to find out what role sporadic non-A, non-B hepatitis has in the hepatitis attributed to transfusion. And before we accept that 50% of cases of non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis progress to chronicity and that 10% of chronic cases progress to liver cirrhosis, larger studies must be done. New studies are also essential because published data on non-A, non-B transmission by transfusion relate to transfusions given before the clean-up of donor panels in the wake of the AIDS epidemic. Over the page, last paragraph, at the top of the page. Even those arguing most forcefully for the significance of non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis recognised that studies on the natural history of chronic non-A non-B hepatitis have been limited both in size and in duration of follow-up, and that the ultimate prognosis of this disease has not been established. So if we just go back to the previous page. You appear to be, you and Dr. Barber, very clearly advocating here that surrogate testing should not be introduced until such time as further studies had been undertaken. Is that fair?
Yes.
One of the reasons you articulate for that is, I think, one of the issues to which you've already referred, that there was more that, there was a lot that was unknown, if I put it that way. You were also concerned about costs and about the potential to lose donors and the need to make arrangements for counselling donors found to be showing one or other of the surrogate markers. Is that right?
Yes.
Was it right to say, even in, given everything you told us yesterday about your evolving understanding in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis, that in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis as at 1987, the consequences seem minor? Was that not underplaying, on any view, the risks in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis?
Yes, I admit that, yeah.
Can I suggest, Professor Contreras, that a problem with the approach described in this letter of undertaking more studies and only then deciding whether or not to introduce the screening would be that you would be perpetuating a state of affairs in which there was no screening or testing whatsoever in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis. You're running the risk of people continuing to be infected while you wait for a more complete understanding of the problem.
Yes. Yes, I have to.
Can I then just ask you to look next at a comment in a regional transfusion directors meeting, July 1987, CBLA 00028, sorry, CBLA 0002383.
Can I just say
yes,
that that unfortunately, perhaps we did not see the problem, and you know, and also I don't know when the study by Seif and by Harris, those studies of the long-term effects and survival were done, but that confirmed what we were thinking at the time, that apparently it wasn't causing more problems than in the general population, from the point of view of mortality, more problems than in the general population. I admit that I was wrong in not having introduced screening before, but unfortunately we were not seeing the problem.
This is the minutes of a meeting, July 1987, the Regional Transfusion Director. So it's after Professor Cash's and his colleagues' letter has been published in the Lancet, but before the response that we were just looking at from you. And if we go, please, to page 8. Bottom half of the page, there's a heading, Letter to Lancet from SNBTS. The chairman referred to both his own reservations and those of other directors about the letter recently published in the Lancet, to which all the Scottish directors were signatories on the subject of anti-HBC and ALT screening of all donations. There was disappointment that unilateral action had been taken, and it was this, rather than the contents of the letter, to which exception was taken, though it was pointed out that the costings quoted in the letter could be challenged. Professor Cash indicated that although he was concerned about the views being expressed, that he had had no alternative. Dr. Whitcho indicated he perceived a different attitude to product liability by SHHD north of the border, which was one of the factors which had prompted the letter. Now, I don't know whether you've got any independent recollection of this meeting at which you were present, Professor Contreras, but the way in which the first half of that paragraph is expressed tends to suggest that the mood of the RTDs was not profound disagreement with what their Scottish colleagues were saying, but just a disappointment that there had been, as it were, a breaking of ranks by the letter being sent. Do you have any recollection of whether that's an accurate reflection of the mood of the meeting?
I might think it might have been the mood of the meeting, but I cannot remember the mood.
We've got a couple of letters that you wrote to Dr. Rotblatt at the Department of Health in late 1987. I'm not going to go to them because they're on really a similar theme to the materials we've already looked at. I'll just give the references for those who might wish to look at them. They're NHBT 0000187_008 and NHBT 0000187_010. And they're letters from you to Dr. Rotblatt, 14th and 22nd of December 1987. I want to then pick matters up in 1988. If we go to NHBT 0000187_024. Again, I'm not going to go through the detail of this, but we can see it's headed Multi-Centre Study of ALT and Anti-HBC Screening of Blood Donations, minutes of meeting of the Steering Committee, Manchester 8th of June 1988. And we can see a number of people in attendance, including from North London, yourself and Dr. Barbara. And then there's an invitation just below those list of attendees for you to chair the Steering Committee. And then we can see paragraph 3, centres participating in the study, Manchester, Bristol, Edgware, Edinburgh's withdrawn. And then there's a discussion about how the study is going to be undertaken. I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but is it right to understand, essentially, it's taken until the middle of 1988 for the funding to be made available to enable the study to even commence?
Yes.
And can you recall what the scope of the study was? We can look at the documents if we need to, but do you have any broad recollection?
It was that 3 centres would test donations from males and females for the prevalence of anticore and ALT raised above a certain level. I think it was 45 international units per litre, but yeah.
Is it right to understand that it was a more limited study than the bigger 2-stage prospective study
Yes.
that you've been discussing earlier?
Yeah, it was just the prevalence in donations.
Then if we move on to 1989, NHBT 50/4. Sorry, I should just say, I'm going to just give a reference and not go to it. There's an RTD meeting in October 1988 at NHBT 0018189, which says that the results of the trial won't be available until the late spring of 1989. I'm just not going to go to it, but just so that we can get the chronology right. Then if we go to NHBT 5043_002, this is the first meeting of something called the UK Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Diseases. And if we go over the page, we've got the date of the meeting, 24th of February 1989, and those present, it's Professor Cash, you, Dr. Follett, Dr. Gunson, Dr. Mitchell, and Dr. Mortimer, and Dr. Wagstaff giving an apology for absence. And then if we can look at paragraph 2, Dr. Gunson introduced the meeting by saying that he had about a year ago discussed the forming of a UK group to determine policy with respect to transfusion-transmitted diseases with Drs. McClelland and Pickles. The Department of Health were in the process of forming such a group, but its brief would be wider than blood transfusion medicine, embracing transplantation and other aspects of disease transmission. This present committee had been formed to discuss transfusion-transmitted diseases and to provide advice to the Departments of Health. So this committee, the Advisory Committee on Transfusion-Transmitted Diseases, was a new committee set up as described by Dr. Gunson there to provide advice to the Departments of Health. What was, as far as you understand, the interrelationship between this committee and its work and the work of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, which you didn't sit on? Yeah. Did you have a clear understanding of their relative roles?
As far as I can remember, the advisory committee had more power, more teeth, and this was just an advisory committee to the main Department of Health committee.
So this committee that we're looking at, the ACTTD, would have discussions, but its thinking might then be communicated to the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood.
Yes.
And then the latter's recommendations might then go to the Department of Health. Yeah.
Well, that was chaired, the Advisory Committee. I learned later because the information from the ACVSD was never shared with us as transfusion directors. But I learned that the department was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer who chaired those meetings. I learned from my reading.
Was that Dr. Metters?
First it was Dr. Harris and then Dr. Metters.
And so is it right to understand that what was happening in the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood might get reported back to you to some extent by Dr. Gunson, but there was no, its minutes, its recommendations, its thinking wasn't formally shared with you?
No, there were secret minutes.
And do you know why that was? It doesn't seem necessarily conducive to the most joined up decision making.
I wish I knew, but there's so many things of the Department of Health I never was able to understand.
And then if we go in this meeting to page 5 and we can look at the discussion about surrogate testing. So we've got the heading non-A, non-B hepatitis. Dr. Contreras outlined the results of the study in England and Wales. So that's the 3-centre study of which North London had been one of the participants. 7.2, Dr. Mitchell reported that in a Glasgow study of 5,000 donations, the ALT exceeded 50 IU in 2.8%. With respect to anti-HBC tests in a separate study, 17 out of 2,000 donations were found positive, of which 15 were reproducible. So there was a study being undertaken in Scotland, largely in parallel with the study that you were undertaking in England and Wales.
Yes.
And then there's a report from Professor Cash about the methodology for ALT testing. And then 7.4, it was agreed that there would be no recommendation to institute ALT testing until the current study was completed in England. However, there was a degree of inevitability about the introduction of the test, which was required by regulatory authorities in other countries to determine the acceptability of fractionated plasma products. This will be discussed with BPL in the near future. At this stage in February 1989, it's right to understand from this, I think, that this committee is not making any recommendation that a decision be made to introduce ALT testing, the plan was complete the study, but there seems to be a recognition that this is something that would inevitably have to come.
Yeah.
And then we see paragraph 7.5, Dr. Gunson reporting that Ortho Pharmaceutical Company had approached him with respect to trials with the Chiron test in the UK. Now that's now talking not about surrogate testing, but about the newly developed test for hepatitis
AntiHCV.
AntiHCV. Although paragraph 7.4 refers to the inevitability about the introduction of, at least for ALT testing, that didn't happen, did it?
No.
Is it right to understand that active consideration in relation to surrogate testing essentially fell into the background because the focus then shifted to anti-HCV testing?
Yes, that's correct.
Can I then just ask you just a little in terms of reflections about surrogate testing more generally in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis? It's right, I think, to understand that in relation to both ALT testing and anti-HBC testing, those were tests which were relatively well known and understood. So you weren't, when I say you, the blood transfusion service of the Department of Health wasn't in the position that it had been with HTLV3 testing and that it might be with anti-HCV testing, where there had to be an evaluation of how well tests worked. It was known that ALT testing and anti-HBC testing could be undertaken relatively simply and straightforwardly.
Yes.
And other than through donor screening, which we've already discussed in some detail, it would be right to understand that there was no other way, was there, of reducing the possibility of transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis at this point in time, other than using either ALT or anti-HBC or both?
Well, as we showed later on with John Barber and my team, the introduction of exclusion of donors, prospective donors in high-risk groups, that decreased the prevalence of anti-core, anti-HBC in blood donations. But that was like a benefit that we didn't expect, or but
as an incidental benefit of what was already being done. I absolutely understand, Professor Contreras, that donor selection, donor screening measures in relation to high-risk groups introduced for other reasons might then have incidental benefits in terms of non-A, non-B hepatitis. But if one leaves aside those measures in relation to selection and screening of donors, there was nothing else available in the 80s until we get to the anti-HCV test, other than surrogate markers. So if anything was going to be done, it would have to have been one or other or both of those.
Yeah. And with hindsight, I would have chosen anti-core because it was more specific, and because we later showed with, well, the virologist, the microbiologist showed that anti-core was also beneficial to exclude the transmission of hepatitis B that was still occurring.
Yes, and if time permits, we might come on to anti-HBC as in relation specifically to hepatitis B this afternoon. But before I turn to ask you about then the decision-making in relation to anti-HCV screening, can I just ask you about two matters relating to registers? So there came a point, if we look at the letter, it'll give us the date, BPLL 0007760_001. This is September 1987. You were writing to Dr. Fraser, who was the Regional Transfusion Director in Bristol, but also chair of the regional transfusion directors, I think at this point in time. You were writing suggesting the formation of a national register for hepatitis B, and Dr. Barbara had volunteered to be the central coordinator of that. Now, I'm not proposing to go through the detail of what you set out here and how it could work, but could you just set out for us your recollection of why you thought that this would be a useful idea and whether it was established in due course?
Yes, I supported firmly the idea of a national register, because we should have national registers for for all transfusion transmitted diseases, infections, particularly transmission by labile blood components. So, and we did not know what the extent of, we knew in our center, but what the extent nationally of hepatitis B transmission was. And this register did take effect, although not all centers contributed in the same way, but it happened. I thought it was a very good proposal, and it would have taught the country a great deal.
And then in relation to hepatitis C, there was, obviously at a later stage, because as of 1987 the anti-HCV test hadn't yet been identified, there was an hepatitis C register. If we just look at your statement at WITN 5711001, page 83. It's paragraph 328, bottom half the page. You refer there to the HCV National Register collecting data from transfusion recipients traced during the HCV look-back exercise. Did you have any direct involvement with the establishment or operation of the HCV register?
I believe we had, because we had meetings with the CDSC and the PHLS. So Dr. Barbara and Dr. Hewitt and myself were always in conversation with the CDSC and the PHLS.
And the question I've been asked to ask you about the HCV register, I don't know if you'll know the answer to this or not, was about patient consent, whether patients were told that their details were being entered on the register, or whether it was done without patient knowledge.
I cannot remember, but I do not know whether they were, no.
We then come to the question of hepatitis C screening. And I think if we pick matters up with a letter that you wrote to Dr. Gunson in January 1989, it's at NHBT 40187_042, please. So the 15th of January, you to Dr. Gunson, and you say, on Thursday I had a meeting with my treasurer who said that it would be very difficult to find the monies for the introduction of anti-HCV screening of blood donations in 1990. He asked whether the provision of central funding would be considered by the Department of Health. Most districts in the North West Thames region are overspent. He's doubtful whether the 2% growth given to all regions in 1990-91 will cover most of the immediate programmes in the North West Thames region. He asked whether I would consider anti-HCV testing as top priority, i.e. more important than the shortening of the waiting lists, and I had to admit that I do not. As you well know, the sums of money involved for anti-HCV screening are considerable, and it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to find the funding within existing resources. Now that's one of a number of letters that or occasions over the course of the next 3 years in which you raised the concern about the cost of anti-HCV screening and your view that it should be funded by the Department of Health. We know it wasn't funded by the Department of Health. Why was it that you thought this should be a Department of Health centrally funded initiative?
Because it was a central decision, and because that had happened with previous screenings. For anti-HIV, there was money for everything, and for anti-HCV, there was no money.
And did you ever learn why it was the department decided that funding for this testing programme was to be met regionally rather than centrally?
I don't know how the department thought, but I would be speculating that perhaps they didn't see it as they saw HIV and as they later saw variant CJD.
Now, in the course of 1989, there were a number of things that happened in relation to consideration of anti-HCV screening. There was, I think, some participation by the North London Centre in the course of 1989 in evaluation of the ortho assay. Is that right?
Yes.
And then...
Can I just for a moment understand the dates here? My understanding is that it wasn't until May of 1988 that the Chiron Corporation announced that it had cloned a virus which was became known as hepatitis C. It was the cause of non-A, non-B hepatitis. And it wasn't then reported quite what the details were until the following year. And it wasn't until, I think, April of 1989, my earliest note is, of any report as to there being an assay, a test which could be used to screen. But the letter we've just been looking at, NHBT 187_042, comes from January 1989 and is talking about the costs of screening. Without there being an actual test being marketed at that stage, or when was the test marketed, as far as you can recall? Was it before the details of the cloning were ever published, or,
No.
or not?
No.
And plainly, it would seem, Ortho had been working on what an assay would look like without the details having been published, except to them, by the Chiron Corporation. Is that probably right?
I think perhaps, yes, sir.
So they would, as it were, corner the market?
Yes, sir.
Yes. But the question then is, what happened when in 1989, after April, when the first, or the assay was announced available for sale, or whatever it actually was at that stage?
Yes, we don't, unfortunately, have a single witness with whom, who was involved in every aspect of it, with whom we can go through a comprehensive chronological account. There'll be some gaps that Dr. Barbara may be able to fill in, and there'll be no doubt, I think, Department of Health witnesses next year who will be able to, again, fill in a lot of the gaps with. Perhaps the figure most centrally involved in terms of attendance at committees and involvement in discussions and so on was Dr. Gunson.
Yes.
And we have, of course, his written and oral testimony to Mr. Justice Burton in a National Blood Authority. But there isn't a single witness with whom we can, I'm afraid, give the overall chronology. There are meetings in which I know Dr. Barbara was involved in the course of 1988, in which the Chiron discovery was being considered and discussed, and he may be able to assist us with how his knowledge of it developed over the second half of 1988 and the course of 1989.
But it would certainly seem that without there being the test actually physically there, everyone was anticipating there would be one.
No, I don't think that that was the case, sir.
Right.
I think that they had a test, but it hadn't been approved in the
I
USA
see.
by the FDA, and so they more or less secretly had a test, you know. But I think that was the case.
Right. I understand.
Yes, and at the meeting that we looked at a few minutes ago, the first meeting of the advisory committee in relation to transfusion transmitted diseases in February 1989, Dr. Gunson described there an approach he'd received from Ortho with respect to conducting trials of the test in the UK.
Yes.
I only looked at the surrogate testing when we looked at it earlier, but there is a passage in those minutes which record Dr. Gunson's conversations.
It was, this is a comment, really, but it was curious that that should come immediately after discussion of whether there should be a surrogate test or a study to see if there should be a surrogate test, rather.
Yeah.
Because you might have thought the purpose of the surrogate test is to identify something which you're now going to trial a direct test for.
And so you're right, I think, in relation to April 1989 was the publication in Science.
Yes.
Of
21st of April, was it?
I've only got April, I'm afraid, written down in my notes, but the publication in the articles in Science about the details of the specific screening test. Dr. Gunson had, in advance of that, drawn up protocols for a proposed trial of the ortho test.
Yes, so there was, if I can summarise it this way, is it a fair summary to say there was developing appreciation that a test was likely and there were candidates or a candidate under consideration in from the beginning of 1989 onwards? Would that be fair?
Yes, we do.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And so my notes again record April 1989, Dr. Gunson meeting with Tyrone, at which it was agreeing that ortho test kits would be supplied to the North London Regional Transfusion Centre to enable a trial and evaluation to be undertaken. Perhaps, well, again, I think we can probably pick this up with other witnesses, but we know one of the things that happened later in 1989, Professor Contreras, was a symposium in Rome in September 1989, which I think Dr. Barber attended. Do you recall whether you attended that or not?
No, I did not.
Again, well, then we can pick that up hopefully with him. And then if we get to October 1989, NHBT 5043_034. So this is the Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Diseases, 9th of October 1989. If we go to bottom of page 2, we can see the heading AntiHCV testing of blood donors. So this gives us a sense of the way in which the decision-making process was being undertaken. The committee were informed that the Department of Health's Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood had requested a briefing paper on policy regarding anti-HCV testing of blood donors. The committee considered 2 papers summarising the first international meeting on the hepatitis C virus prepared by Drs. Gunson and Mitchell, and a paper on the results of an anti-HCV UK study on surrogate markers for non-A and B post-transfusion hepatitis in blood donors. We go to the top of the next page. After a wide-ranging and careful consideration of the many problems regarding the test and its introduction for routine screening of blood donations, it was agreed that Dr. Gunson's paper should be used as the basis of the paper to be submitted to the Department's committee. It was also agreed that Dr. Gunson's paper should incorporate information from the papers prepared by Drs. Mitchell and Rapat, as well as a number of textual amendments proposed by the committee. It might be said to be a somewhat laborious decision-making process, but what we appear to have here is Dr. Gunson putting together a paper with, I'm not going to take you to the details of his paper, Professor, but putting together a paper with his views, recommendations in relation to testing. That's, as it were, considered by this committee upon which you sit, the ACTDD, but it's going to go then to the ACVSB because is it right, it's the ACVSB that's charged with not making the decision, but making formal recommendations to the Department of Health.
Yes.
And then it's the Department of Health that makes the decision. Was that your understanding of it? Whether at the time or having looked back at the material now, do you have any thoughts or observations upon the speed or lack of speed with which the decisions were taken over this period from 1989 through to 1991?
Yes, the lack of speed.
We can then, I think, see you reporting back to a divisional meeting in October 89 at NHBT 0017553_001. So this is a meeting of the Eastern Division of Consultants, chaired by you. And if we turn to page 6, at bottom of the page, anti-HCV testing, not yet licensed by FDA, but the UK is likely to commence testing around June, July 1990. Concern was expressed that there's no confirmatory test. Dr. Contreras informed the meeting that Dr. Gunson's recommendation to the DHSS was that the UK should start testing 1, only after FDA licensing, 2, when confirmatory testing is available, and 3, there is provision for counselling. The financial implication for the UK is likely to be over £5.5 million. It's been estimated it would cost the North London Blood Transfusion Centre over £600,000 per year at the rate of £1.70 plus VAT per test. This cost excludes the replacement of the 1% or so donors who would be lost. If we leave aside the financial issue, Professor Contreras, there are 3 preconditions here identified in terms of what's going to be, it said, recommended through Dr. Gunson to the Department of Health. The first relates to FDA licensing. Why was the UK's commencement of testing to be dependent upon the grant of a licence from the FDA?
Because they, like the MCA, can they're very strict in the approval of a test. So they would have very sensibly looked at all the aspects of the testing before approving it for use in the United States, and we didn't have that mechanism here.
The second precondition was when confirmatory testing is available. Is that because of the concern about the possibility of false positives?
Yes.
And then 3, provision for counselling. Counselling would take what form in relation to an anti-HCV positive test?
We would have to contact the donor, ask him to come to the blood centre, or to go to somewhere where he could be counselled. We would have to test him, tell him that he or she was anti-HCV positive, that he might be carrying an infection, that he would not be able to donate again, and we would refer that patient, we would advise that patient to go to a hepatologist that we would have contacted.
Now, I can see that there are obviously resource implications in relation to that, but it's not it's not a particularly complex system, is it, to set up? Leaving aside the question of obviously funding, and it'll take a certain amount of time, and you need to have the doctors who have the capacity to do that. But it's not a difficult system. Indeed, it's a system you'd have been familiar with you
For
and
other
other centres, but because of other testing.
Yes.
So is there any particular reason why the need to make provision for counselling should have held things up?
The cost, again, it's always cost, because we would have needed a great deal of manpower to, and it's doctors.
Can you recall, bearing in mind this is a meeting as at October 1989, and the expectation at this point is the UK is likely to commence testing in mid-1990. Can you recall when at North London Centre you started making the arrangements or putting in place the arrangements for counselling?
As I think it must have been as soon as we knew that we were going to start testing.
Because is it right to understand that, perhaps in contrast with the position relating to surrogate testing, there was never any doubt, was there, that testing for HCV would be introduced, really? The question was always going to be when. So centres would know that, on any view, that this was coming.
Yes.
Then if we look at, again, there are various publications, some of which you contribute to over the following months, but I don't think we need to go through the details of them all, and we've got them in the papers that the inquiry has. Perhaps we could pick it up at NHBT 0071870_002, which is January 1990. So we've now got the National Directorate established for the National Blood Transfusion Service, and this is its National Management Committee, of which you were a member, and the meeting's the 4th of January 1990, and you were present at the meeting. We can see what's happening in relation to AntiHCV at page 4. Under the heading Pilot Trial on AntiHCV Testing, bottom half of the page, Dr. Gunson tabled a report which summarised the findings of the pilot studies on anti-HCV tests in the North East Thames, Trent and West Midlands regions, and which included comments on the tests from North East Thames and Trent. So there's some pilot studies, obviously, by this point in time have been completed. I'm not going to go through the detail of the discussion then. If we go to the top of the next page, first paragraph tells us Dr. Gunson is going to prepare a more comprehensive report for distribution to all RTCs and to the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. He then advises that the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood was to complete a cost-benefit exercise on the introduction of anti-HCV testing. There's then just a reference to the Abbott test, so there's a second test now available for evaluation, is that right?
Yes.
And then if we go just to the next paragraph further down, it says, with regard to the absence of a confirmatory test, Dr. Gunson advised the committee that the ACVSB did not see this necessarily as a barrier to the introduction of routine screening, but the ACVSB would insist that any test for routine use must have been licensed by the FDA. You've told us already, I think, that you didn't see the minutes of the ACVSB meetings. Those were regarded as secret or confidential. Did you have any particular understanding of through Dr. Gunson or through any other means, of the ACVSB's approach to the question of confirmatory testing?
No.
Okay. So you don't know whether their thinking was, well, we can start screening and perhaps deal with the availability of confirmatory testing as and when it becomes available, but it shouldn't hold up the introduction of screening. You don't know if that's what they were thinking?
I think that's what I read.
Okay. And then if we go further down the page, There's a reference to you. Dr. Contreras said that about 1% of those tested in the North West Thames region have been found to be repeatedly positive, but not all of these were found to be infectious. It appeared that not all of those who'd received blood donated by such people had developed HCV. So that, is it right to understand that's the finding from the pilot study that was undertaken in your region?
It must have been, yes.
And then it's described the prevalence of HCV in England and Wales appears to be similar to that experienced in some states in the USA, but lower than the estimated prevalence in Denmark, Italy, Spain, and about the same as in Finland. Now, I'm not going to go through the details of all the countries which introduced hepatitis C screening before the UK did, but you would have presumably have become aware, particularly in the course of 1990, that a number of other countries had introduced or were about to introduce anti-HCV screening into their nations.
Yes.
Do you recall being concerned, or your fellow regional transfusion directors being concerned that the UK was taking longer, was lagging behind what was happening in other developed nations?
Unfortunately, I wasn't concerned at the time, if I remember correctly. Unfortunately, because of the nature of the beast, because the test had no confirmatory assay, and because it had so many false positives. I should have been concerned, but I wasn't.
And then, again, without taking you, I think, unnecessarily to meetings, if I just give a couple of or reference for the transcript, NHBT 5043_047 is the March 1990 meeting of the Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Diseases, which reports that the ACVSB had deferred making a decision until its next meeting at the end of April. And then the next, I think, date of significance, again, I'm not going to take you to the underlying documents because it relates to a meeting you didn't attend, but the ACVSB, I think in July 1990, decided that there needed to be a pilot study of both the ortho and the Abbott tests. So what I want to do then is just pick matters up with a document authored by you at the end of 1990, Professor Contreras. It's NHBT 40190_067. So it's the 17th of December 1990 from you to Dr. Barber and Dr. Brennan. I've read the FDA regulations for anti-HCV and the revised recommendations for the prevention of HIV transmission. I must admit that the Americans have put themselves in a very awkward position regarding anti-HCV testing with no recommendations for supplementary tests. Is supplementary there a synonym for confirmatory tests?
Yeah, yes.
When will they learn? I pity those physicians who will have to explain the possible significance of test results to repeatedly reactive donors. And then the next paragraph deals with an issue relating to HIV. And then the last paragraph is saying, I'm bemused after reading these two documents. I just cannot understand the FDA thinking. Looking at that now, Professor Contreras, why were you so bemused or perplexed at what was being done in the USA?
If I remember correctly, at that time, I said we knew that the test had a lot of false positives, or that there were too many positives to the number of real positives. And that there was no way of knowing which of those units, donations, was the one that was transmitting HCV. So I was bemused that the FDA was not insisting on a confirmatory test or not mentioning it.
I'm going to then pick the chronology up in 1991 with a series of letters. So rather than do one of them now and then come back to the rest of them after lunch, perhaps we could take lunch now a couple of minutes early and then do them as a coherent sequence.
Well, we'll do that and come back at 2 o'clock. So 2 o'clock, please, for lunch, after lunch.